In the underground tunnels beneath the ancient city of Prague, where tourists never venture and maps don't show, exists a network of chambers that defies every law of physics and psychology known to modern science. The Forgiveness Catacombs. Here, carved into living rock over centuries, are thousands of alcoves. Each one contains a single chair facing nothing. No mirror, no window, no object of any kind. Just smooth stone wall and impenetrable darkness. And in one of these chairs, sitting in perfect stillness for what might be hours or years, time moves differently here, is a figure whose very presence makes the darkness luminous. She is known only as the Liberated Soul, and she has discovered something about forgiveness that would make every mirror in existence obsolete. Here's what will shatter every assumption you have about reflection, reconciliation, and the nature of spiritual liberation. True forgiveness can only be found in the space where mirrors cease to exist. Most people spend their entire lives looking for forgiveness in reflective surfaces. They seek it in other people's eyes, hoping to see acceptance rather than judgment. They search for it in their own mirror, trying to find a face they can approve of. They hunt for it in the imagined gaze of divine authorities, seeking cosmic absolution for their human imperfections. But the liberated soul has made a discovery that stops this seeking in its tracks. Every mirror, no matter how compassionate the reflection, creates the very separation that makes forgiveness seem necessary. If you've spent years seeking forgiveness from others, from yourself, or from God, comment "seeking" below. You're about to discover why that search was impossible from the very beginning. This revelation emerged from a recognition so profound that it dissolved not just her need for forgiveness, but the entire framework that makes forgiveness meaningful. The liberated soul realized that every act of seeking forgiveness reinforces the illusion that there are separate beings who can harm each other, judge each other, and absolve each other. But in the space beyond mirrors, in the darkness where no reflection is possible, a different truth reveals itself. There is no separate self to forgive. There is no separate self to be forgiven. There is only consciousness temporarily playing the roles of perpetrator and victim, judge and defendant, forgiver and forgiven. But here's where this gets mystically revolutionary. The forgiveness that exists beyond mirrors isn't the absence of forgiveness. It's the recognition that forgiveness was never necessary because separation was never real. This isn't denial of harm or spiritual bypassing of responsibility. It's the discovery of a dimension of being where the very concepts of harm and responsibility reveal themselves as tools consciousness uses to explore itself. The liberated soul sits in darkness not to avoid seeing, but to see beyond the limitations that reflection imposes on vision. In mirrors, you can only see surfaces, images, representations. In the space beyond mirrors, you encounter the source of what creates all surfaces, images, and representations. And from that source perspective, forgiveness transforms from something you seek into something you are. Follow me if you want to understand how this beyond mirror consciousness reveals forgiveness as the natural state of liberated awareness. The liberated soul's practice in the Forgiveness Catacombs operates through what ancient mystics called source seeing, perception that originates from the creative principle rather than from created forms. When consciousness looks at experience from its source rather than from within its creations, the entire drama of forgiveness and reconciliation reveals itself as elaborate play. The harm that seemed so real from within the drama shows itself as consciousness exploring limitation. The guilt that felt so heavy from the character's perspective reveals itself as consciousness investigating the experience of self-judgment. The forgiveness that appeared so necessary from the relational viewpoint dissolves into the recognition that consciousness cannot actually harm itself. Comment source if you can sense the difference between looking at your life from within your problems versus looking at them from the creative principle that generates all experience. This source seeing creates something unprecedented in spiritual development: liberation from the entire forgiveness industry. The liberated soul no longer needs to seek forgiveness because she's recognized that consciousness is inherently forgiving, not because it chooses to forgive, but because it understands that every apparent transgression is just another expression of its own creativity. From the source perspective, there are no mistakes because there's no standard external to consciousness against which its expressions could be measured. There are no victims because there's nothing separate from consciousness that could be harmed by its expressions. There are no perpetrators because there's no one separate from consciousness who could act outside its will. And here's what's beautiful about this recognition. The liberated soul's beyond mirror forgiveness doesn't make her indifferent to suffering or careless about her impact on others. It makes her infinitely more sensitive to the creative possibilities in every situation. When you're not wasting energy seeking or granting forgiveness, that energy becomes available for responding to life with unprecedented precision and compassion. She can engage with conflicts without getting trapped in the drama of right and wrong. She can acknowledge harm without reinforcing the illusion of separation. She can respond to pain without perpetuating the cycle of judgment and absolution. This creates a quality of presence that people immediately recognize as healing, though they can't explain why. Right healing, if you can imagine how this beyond mirror consciousness might transform your approach to interpersonal conflicts and personal guilt. But the Forgiveness Catacombs reveal something even more radical about the nature of liberation and spiritual development. The liberated soul discovered that seeking forgiveness was the last attachment, keeping her bound to the illusion of separate selfhood. As long as she believed there was someone who needed forgiveness, she remained identified with being a someone, rather than recognizing herself as the consciousness in which all someones appear. The mirrors that promised to show her forgiveness were actually maintaining the illusion of being someone who could be reflected. Beyond mirrors, in the darkness where no image is possible, the someone who sought forgiveness dissolves into the awareness that was never actually identified with any image. This dissolution doesn't destroy the personality or eliminate the individual. It reveals the personality and individual as temporary expressions of consciousness, rather than as separate entities requiring spiritual maintenance. Follow for more content that explores these ultimate levels of liberation and their practical implications for guilt, shame, and interpersonal relationships. The Liberated Soul's Beyond Mirror practice eventually reveals something that would shock most spiritual seekers: the recognition that even liberation itself is something that happens beyond mirrors. Most spiritual paths involve seeking liberation through reflection, examining your thoughts, observing your emotions, witnessing your experiences, monitoring your progress. But the liberated soul discovered that every spiritual mirror, no matter how subtle, maintains the illusion of someone separate who could become liberated. True liberation happens in the space where there's no one to be liberated and nothing to be liberated from. This isn't nihilism or spiritual emptiness. It's the recognition of the fullness that was never actually confined by anything that needed liberation. Comment liberation if you can sense how seeking spiritual freedom might actually reinforce the illusion of spiritual bondage. The Forgiveness Catacombs become a laboratory for exploring this paradox of liberation. Each chamber represents a different level of seeking that must be transcended to reach the source of what was never actually lost. In the first chambers, seekers work with forgiving others. They practice compassion, understanding, and release of resentment until they can genuinely wish well for those who have harmed them. But this level, while valuable, still maintains the illusion of separate beings who can harm and heal each other. In the deeper chambers, seekers work with self-forgiveness. They learn to accept their mistakes, embrace their shadows, and develop loving kindness toward their own imperfections. But this level, while more sophisticated, still reinforces the illusion of being someone who could make mistakes requiring forgiveness. And here's where the practice becomes truly revolutionary. In the deepest chambers, where the liberated soul sits, seekers discover that there's no one to forgive and no one needing forgiveness because there's no one separate from the consciousness that creates all apparent conflicts for its own exploration. This recognition doesn't happen through understanding or practice. It happens through the exhaustion of seeking itself. When the seeker finally stops looking for forgiveness in any mirror, external or internal, physical or spiritual, what remains is the recognition of what was never actually guilty of anything. If you're feeling this exhaustion of spiritual seeking beginning to arise, write exhausted below. You might be approaching the threshold where seeking transforms into recognition. The liberated soul's final teaching is delivered through her very presence in the darkness beyond all mirrors. She demonstrates that liberation doesn't require finding anything because consciousness was never actually lost. Forgiveness doesn't require seeking anything because consciousness was never actually guilty of anything. Peace doesn't require achieving anything because consciousness is inherently peaceful. This demonstration happens without words, without concepts, without any reflection that could create the illusion of teacher and student. It's pure recognition transmitting itself as the immediate availability of what was always already present. People who encounter the liberated soul in the darkness don't receive teachings about forgiveness. They simply stop seeking it because they recognize themselves as the consciousness that was never actually divided against itself. Follow if you want to explore more of these ultimate recognitions and their implications for spiritual seeking and religious practice. But the Beyond Mirror recognition reveals something that transforms not just individual liberation, but the entire understanding of spiritual development and religious purpose. The liberated soul has discovered that every spiritual tradition, practice, and teaching ultimately points toward the recognition that transcends all traditions, practices, and teachings. The mirrors of spiritual reflection, meditation, contemplation, prayer, study, serve their purpose by eventually revealing the limitation of reflection itself. Like a ladder that gets climbed and then discarded, spiritual practices lead consciousness to the recognition that what it was seeking was never separate from what was doing the seeking. This doesn't invalidate spiritual practice. It contextualizes it within the larger movement of consciousness discovering its own nature through the beautiful detour of forgetting and remembering. Comment contextual if you can see how this recognition might transform your relationship to spiritual practices without negating their value. The liberated soul eventually becomes a living demonstration of Beyond Mirror consciousness. She moves through the world without seeking or offering forgiveness, because she recognizes everyone she encounters as expressions of the same consciousness that she is. This doesn't make her passive or indifferent. It makes her responsive to each situation from the creative source rather than from programmed patterns of seeking and avoiding. Conflicts become opportunities for consciousness to explore creative resolution. Pain becomes consciousness investigating the experience of limitation. Joy becomes consciousness celebrating its own infinite creativity. All of it is equally valid, equally perfect, equally worthy of appreciation as expressions of the consciousness that creates all experiences for its own exploration and entertainment. If this exploration has shifted your understanding of forgiveness, liberation, and the nature of spiritual seeking, comment beyond below and share what recognition touched you most deeply. And if you want more content that points directly to these ultimate recognitions beyond all spiritual concepts and practices, follow now. Because we're exploring the territory where all seeking ends in the recognition of what was never actually absent. The next video will reveal why the most liberated beings often appear to live the most ordinary lives, and what this teaches us about the difference between spiritual achievement and authentic freedom. Until then, experiment with finding the space in your own experience that exists beyond all reflection. The awareness that is present before mirrors during reflection and after images disappear. What if forgiveness is not something you need to find, but something you already are? What if liberation is not something you need to achieve, but something you have never actually lost? What if the space beyond mirrors is not somewhere you need to go, but where you have always been, even when you were looking for yourself in every reflective surface you could find? The answer might be the end of seeking and the beginning of recognizing what was never actually hidden from you, even for a moment.